All right. So, Tim, this is Reclaim Today. Is that right?
It certainly is.
And this is live.
It's live. It's on demand. It's in 27 locations coming at you. Apple TV, Roku.
Don King is going to be producing us. It's going big.
Should go the other direction. Instead of mass distribution, it'll be distributed nowhere. If you don't catch it live, you never saw it.
You never saw it, which means it will never be watched.
It's the nobody's listening for video, like you said. I like it.
I do. So what I wanted to talk with you about today in the time we have is, I saw a tweet from Tony Hurst, and we've been going back and forth with Tony Hurst in this kind of weird, disjuncted conversation about like what's next in terms of Reclaim's hosting and how do we host cloud applications? What does that mean with stuff like Docker, containers? And it's interesting stuff. We've been talking about this since 2014, 2013 with Ken Lane. Right. We even brought him into UMW and we talked extensively for a day or two about what an API-driven container-based hosting infrastructure would look like. I mean, we had that conversation early. Things got in the way in terms of like us actually growing as a company. But it's funny how we circle back to these ideas. And I bring up Tony Hurst because one of the things he linked me to that I then shared with you is this service called Zeit Now, which is, from what I understand, and this is why I need you on this call, because my understanding hits the brick wall behind you very fast and hard, and it hurts people who listen and realize that I'm misinforming them. But the way I understand Zeit Now is, this is basically Docker container hosting that you can, through GitHub, not only deploy a container, but host it through Zeit Now, and they charge you for usage. I imagine it's by month or by day even, or by hour, based on how the cloud could do it. But it's effectively, you are able to spin up and host your own container. Right. So this is of interest to us for many reasons. One of which is I get a ticket a week about I want to run R or Shiny, or I have this new application. A guy from Israel reached out not too long ago and said, I want to run this thing called Dataset, which is actually what Tony Hurst had used Zeit Now to run. And so it's all these people who have these very specific applications. A lot of that is data analysis applications, which R, Shiny, and a Dataset is. Now, when I say R Shiny, am I even saying that right? Like, is R Shiny like a suite of tools? Is it a specific visualization tool?
You're kind of asking the wrong person. I'm definitely no kind of data scientist or data analysis type person, but my understanding is that R is the programming language, and you set up a Shiny server to run Shiny apps, and Shiny apps are a implementation of using R for specific things. So I think it's all kind of, used in the same respect, but I think R is sort of the underlying language, which I had done a course a couple years back playing with R. I can't remember a single thing from it, just because it wasn't really useful to the kind of things that I play around with day to day. But for many people it is in terms of data analysis stuff. But R is the language, and then you can set up a server with R, but a lot of people are setting up servers with Shiny so that they can run Shiny apps. And I think Shiny apps are maybe an easier way to be introduced and to use the R language, sort of a more onboarded way to do that.
And another application we hear about running in a specific container-based situation is like Jupyter Notebooks.
Right, yeah, exactly.
So we hear about this a lot regularly from people who want to do this stuff. And when I saw Tony Hurst and I followed Tony Hurst's link to Zeit Now, what I thought was really interesting about their infrastructure is if you have some knowledge of GitHub and you can deploy and you have, I believe, Docker running on your laptop or wherever on your server, you can deploy it. You can deploy it pretty easily. So what I'm going to ask you to do, and I'm kind of putting you on the spot here, Tim, is I'm going to see if you can get Dataset, that application, up and running through Zeit Now.
You're killing me. I don't even know what Dataset is. That's where I am.
That's messed up. That's the whole point. You don't need to know.
Oh, okay. Yeah. I don't know about that. Well, And let's back up a bit here, because actually, so like when I was playing around a little bit with Zeit Now, so I haven't played with Dataset at all, but I did play around with, I guess it's just called Now, and the company is called Zeit.co, if I understand that relationship properly. And I was playing around a little bit with it, and it's not just Docker. So it's Node.js applications, and it's also static HTML. So, obviously a lot of people are interested in the idea of using static HTML templates, for speed and performance, or just for ease of use. Things like Jekyll and that, it can generate static HTML. But, there's HTML5 up templates and things like that as well. And so you could just have a static set of HTML files and push that, and it'll be hosted on this Now service. So that's another way to do it. So it was those three specific things. And it kind of reminds me, and I never played around with the service too much, but a lot of developers love it. It's called Heroku. Heroku was a way to really quickly fire up a small instance of a server that would do specific things. And it wasn't like you had root login to like set up whatever you wanted. It was sort of just like on-demand hosting for projects and stuff like this. And so to be able to do it really quickly and easily is very cool. And it doesn't necessarily require you to even use GitHub. When I was playing around with it, I was not using GitHub. The way where GitHub ties into it is that, let's say that you have a project that you developed yourself, and that is living on GitHub. Instead of having to download the code and then send it to Now, you can set it up so that anytime you update your code, it will push it to Now's hosted service. So if you're actually a company and your code base is living on GitHub, you can have a direct link between GitHub and this hosted service without having to run your own servers necessarily. Or you could fork your own GitHub project from someone else, and then as you make your updates in there, it would push those directly to this Now service. So it's watching your repository for any kind of changes, and anytime it does, it pushes those changes directly to their hosted infrastructure, which is interesting.
So one of the things I didn't see when I played with it was I didn't see the idea of where you would use a file manager-like interface. Like the only thing I saw was the ability to push through GitHub. Right. So I didn't see like where you would push. And I do think Zeit Now is still focused on the developer, and they're clear about that. Like, this is a developer infrastructure. But what I liked about it was how seamlessly it allowed you to push applications that were container-based or on Docker into a hosting environment. Yeah. Right? I mean, it was basically a couple of commands and you're up and running.
Yeah, let me share my screen. I'm going to share my whole screen here, I think.
Share it all, Tim.
I'm a sharing person. As soon as I turn my do not disturb notifications on, and then I'll share. But because I've got up the link that you sent.
Okay, good.
That specific one, the data center link.
Data set,
sorry.
Like cassette, but for data.
Gotcha. Okay. So let me pull this up here. So I'm looking at that GitHub URL right now. And, if I were to look at this and figure out what it was running, I would assume probably Python. I see .py files in there. So I'm going to assume it runs Python, but no clue there. But a key thing there is that Docker file. So they built what is essentially a set of rules to set up a Docker instance from it. And yeah, you can see like in this Docker file, there's some things where it's basically kind of like a laundry list of setting up a server. And so they're saying, start with a container that's got already a build of Python on there. And then I want you to install these things, SQLite, a couple other tools, and then copy over these specific things from my repository for dataset to make it work. And it should all be up and running. So it's got that Docker file, but you would need to have a server running Docker in order to use this. I don't at the moment. I just have my laptop. So, but let me go ahead and download this. So I'm going to download it as a zip file onto my computer and open it up. So I've got this folder now, dataset master, which is the GitHub repository, right?
Yes.
Now also, if I open up the application, it has no main interface except for what's up in my menu bar here, right? So, and this keeps an activity of all the stuff that you've done with it so far. So check this out. because it can kind of seem, if you look at the website for Now, it kind of can seem like, well, you need to know command line, you need to do all this stuff. You don't. You need to drag the folder up to that Now icon.
Cool.
And it warns you that any code that you're putting up here, technically somebody could see the logs. So all that code is sort of on their open source plan, which is what the OSS plan is. Everything is kind of open. So somebody, if they went to the right URL structure, they could get the logs of the server and that kind of thing too. Something to be aware of for sure if you're using private stuff. If you're just playing around with tools, go for it. So I'm going to hit deploy on that. And that sort of fires off some stuff in here. So let's see.
You should scroll down there.
Well, I'm wondering if it crashed just now. Let's see. Let's try it one more time, because I think it should give us some information about what's happening. There you go. So that's it. It actually opened up a window for me in my browser, and it's now building this Docker container for me. And keep in mind, I didn't have to create a server. I didn't have to install Docker. I didn't have to do anything. So this is a hosted service, but this is a way for you to kind of play around with Docker. If somebody's already created the Docker file and it's got all those instructions, it's pretty wild, right? Because you don't have to.
You didn't even have to install Docker.
I didn't have to install Docker. I didn't have to open a terminal.
You're telling me that you didn't even have to install Docker.
Yeah, no, and I didn't even have to open the terminal. So I didn't have to type a single command, which I think is actually pretty cool. You can download something from GitHub. You can drag it up to that Now icon, and it starts building, which it's doing right now, which is cool. That's awesome. So that may take a few minutes. And to be quite honest with you, I don't know what it being finished actually looks like.
Well, here's a great example. Like while that's doing that, and we don't really necessarily have to worry about that because I don't know data set either. But this is a question we get on a regular basis at Reclaim. I'm trying to run this application, and in this example, it was data set. And I went and looked it up, and I saw that it was Python, but I didn't know that it was specifically run in our environment, and it wouldn't. But here's an example where someone who, maybe can't use Reclaim for whatever reason, could experiment with hosting that is through something like Zeit Now that allows you to do it. And I didn't even know, which is why I'm so glad we did this, that you could do the drag and drop from GitHub, right, or from the master GitHub repository onto the Zeit Now icon. That is amazing.
Yeah, they promote pretty heavily their command line interface because obviously one of their audiences, and probably their primary audience, is developers. And so developers love command line tools. And so that's one way to interface with it. When you install the program on like your Mac, it also installs things so that you could open up terminal and just type like Now with a URL or something, and it'll start firing things off, and you can interface directly with them through the terminal. But yeah, that drag and drop thing is pretty cool for sure.
Now let me ask you this, Tim. We're playing with a tool called CloudRun, right? Yep. We're trying to get other schools to experiment with. And for those who are listening, CloudRun is very similar to Zeit Now in some ways in that it's a Docker container installer. It's a very nice hosted interface where they have a list of installers that they have kind of customized for their environment. You click on them, they let you point DNS, they let you back it up, get HTTPS, and off and running with stuff like Ghost, etc. So how, in your mind, are the two different and similar, Tim? And what does this mean for the future of us trying to think about hosting containers or enabling to bring this into our kind of our broader infrastructure at Reclaim? Because it's something we've been talking about for years.
No, it's a great question because obviously, there are a lot of different services and a lot of different tools that are taking advantage of Docker right now and have been for several years. So one thing to keep in mind with the Now service is that it's a hosted service. So by me dragging and dropping that, it's putting the files on a separate server that I have no control over. So, as an end user, I might not care as much about that. People assign that control to us all the time. People put their own HTML files and everything on a Reclaim hosting server. As a hosting provider, that kind of leaves me in a different situation, because I can't necessarily use the Now service with end users, from what I've read anyway. So I'm not sure if Now is open source. I don't know if there's a way to run a Now server. That might be an interesting way at it if we wanted to sort of do a more community-based thing specifically for education, whether or not we could spin up our own instance of the larger server. But I imagine there's issues with that, because of course they've got Mac apps, they've got, all those interfaces there, and they're all built directly to work with that specific website. So you want to think of that as a hosted service. I compare it to, like, whether you want to run your own email or if you want to have it hosted by Google through Gmail or something like that. So it's how far down the levels you want to go with that stuff. So Cloudron's interesting because it actually does allow you can set up a Cloudron server. And so, and in fact, that's really what they're pushing. While they have some managed hosting pieces, for the most part, they want you to buy your own server or lease one, or set up a VPS on DigitalOcean as an example, and then install their software. And when you install their software, it sets up a Cloudron server that you can then install these apps. So your data is living on your server. The Cloudron folks don't have access to it unless you give it to them. So it's a little bit of a different relationship there from the Now service, which is really meant to say, like, I've built my own personal application, or our company's built this app, and we need a quick way to deploy it. And they're built for that. They're built for scale. They're built to make it easy to work with repos and containers for people who just want to play around with stuff. But at the point where you need some sort of long term and something that you own, it probably makes more sense to run your own server. And Cloudron might still be a nice onboarding middle piece to that, because it can be easier to run different Docker applications. And Cloudron, I think, is very much more focused on the end user and consumer rather than the developer. The key difference there is that while Cloudron is built on top of Docker, you have to have a specific Cloudron containerized application. It still uses Docker, but there are specific ways in which you build a container that works on Cloudron. It's not as easy as taking a Docker file and saying, hey, fire it up for me. Whereas I found that you actually can do that with the Now service. So just because Cloudron's handling other things, there's different permissions and user-based stuff. It's a different aspect to that. So
from a hosting company point of view, though, what Zeit Now did is pretty amazing.
It is. And I didn't even show this, but I'm happy to. So when I was playing around earlier with it, I was actually even able to map a domain to it. So, which is really cool. I was playing around, I have to find the GitHub repo for this. This is a not a service. This is a application called Dillinger. I think that's pronounced like that. And it's actually a Markdown editor. If we go to the website, you can read a little bit about it. It's Dillinger.io.
Yeah, I think like John Dillinger.
Oh, there you go. Yeah. So, and when you open up the main website, it's actually a demonstration of what this looks like. And it's essentially a Markdown editor. You've got on one side Markdown, the other side is the preview of what that would look like. And it's got different options to be able to export it to PDFs, to HTML. And they also have options to be able to save it to Dropbox, GitHub, and other services like that. So as I was going through here, I was like, hey, they have a Docker file. So maybe this would be an example of me playing around with this. And I did. If you go up here and I can scroll down, you can see where I dragged it into there, and it created, when you drag it in there, it creates a URL automatically. And this is really cool, I think, the way that they use domains as well, because you get a domain as soon as you drop the files in there and it starts building, and it's like, this is where it's going to live. And then you can later map something else to it, but that domain always works. And if you push from a repo to it, like let's say you make some changes and you push those changes to it, they give you a new URL and the old one redirects to it. So all those domains always live, so, and these of course are subdomains of now.sh, which is theirs. But I was able to map markdown.timowens.io to it. So if I go there, if it's still working, I haven't played with it in a couple days, but hopefully the mapping piece is still live on this. I could, of course, go to their subdomain, but it's kind of interesting to think of it as a hosted service where where I'm not having to deal with keeping it up and maintaining it or anything like that. And they're doing all of that level of things. And I'm just able to map a URL onto it in the same way you would with Tumblr or any of these other services. Can't get that one to load. So.
Yeah, which is it's wild too, because like if someone sets up a dataset instance and they want dataset.timowens.io, bam, there's their instance. Like, sure, it is. Oh, nice. There it is.
And they handle it with Let's Encrypt as well. So you'll notice that's on SSL, and they did the whole SSL certificate provisioning and all that kind of stuff as well. So, it was pretty interesting. And that was, again, me not doing anything with code. I downloaded the same way that I did with that other one, Dataset. I just downloaded it from GitHub and dragged it up there, and it built everything for me. And then as soon as it was done building, I went to the URL that they had already given me, and it was up and online. So.
Yeah, that's cool, because I got the GitHub repository running for the default one where they show you the HTML sites when you set up your account on Zeit Now. So that worked. But then I went and I installed Docker, and I was messing around with Docker on my computer, and that's going to lead to a complete train wreck, which it did. But then I'm seeing you just drag and dropping, and I'm like, hey, the futurism of containers. Drag and drop technology.
The future is now.
The future is Zeit Now.
Zeit Now. I think that needs to be the title of this episode, for sure.
The future is Zeit Now. Well, I just think it was really cool, and I appreciate you playing with it. It's one of the things I also appreciate about this and the space we're in. And I thought when I saw it, I was like, this is an awesome model for Docker hosting. So
it definitely is. And I'm interested in playing with other Node apps too. There are applications out there where they haven't gotten around to turning them into Docker containers, but if it's a Node.js app, that should work as well. There may be some applications that it's not best suited for. I haven't looked into, like, for example, like, could you run a discourse community? Which of course runs Docker, but they have their own stuff as well. So, it's Docker, but it's more complicated Docker setup. So I don't know if you could do that on now.sh or something along those lines. I imagine there may be some limits. And then of course there's the pricing and the infrastructure. It's free to play around with. It's free for a certain amount, I think, of bandwidth and stuff like that. As you get into more intensive uses, or if you need to run a whole lot of different things at the same time, if you need your code to be private, still that warning that it showed up before, all of those start to get into paid plans. And so I haven't looked into that too much, but it's very cool that they have a free service that you can just play around with, just to get a sense of, would this be difficult to run? How could you run it? And that kind of stuff, as opposed to having to fire up a VPS. And like you said, if you have to install Docker, it's like, okay, this is, already starting to get a little bit of a tenuous relationship. And then to try and figure out how to do SSL certificates on top of that, mapping your domains, it all starts to really complicate matters.
And I think the original tweet from Tony had to do with someone who wanted to use, and with Tony, it's always like next level stuff. I gotta always be like, but the thing for me is the person wanted to have their database, the databases actually via API, pushed out to a service. So a service that basically fed or served or hosted just databases via API. And he said Zeit Now, the person who was doing that said Zeit Now does something like that, but it's too expensive. So I don't know that, and I would have to go back to the original tweet. But he was saying, is this something that Reclaim could do? And I was like, Tony, you're about 3 or 4 years ahead of us. Let us catch up.
Right.
But the broader point, though, is, and you're looking at Dataset, is, the fact that, faculty and students or other folks, researchers who are out there who want to do this stuff, David Wiley was very interested in the R stuff when we were at OER 18 in Bristol. And so I just think that, like, here is some good examples for that community, for the people who need these apps, because I hate to turn people away. Yeah. Right. And while it may not run on Reclaim, the fact is there's some cool technology out there that's doing it. And to find that it's drag and drop is just mind blowing, even for me.
It's interesting, and I'll mention this here because I just noticed that I went to check back on that and check out the little error message I got at the bottom. The built image exceeds the 100 megabyte limit. So when it's building that Docker container out of those instructions, I guess there are limits to that free account in order to run this. So this built image is 157 megabytes, and it exceeds their limit, presumably with the free plan, I would think. So
that's right. Yeah, because there is a 100 megabyte limit on the free plan.
Yeah. So, and again, I don't know like the specifics of this particular application, if it's more heavy than others, but something to think about, like whether it would fit in and, be useful. So, but it wasn't necessarily able to get it up and running, but it got all the way to building the application. So I assume it would have run if I was not on the free plan. So,
yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, you know what? I'm really blown away by how much we covered in a short 30 minutes.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I think Reclaim Today might be one of the best things on the internet right now.
It's hot. It's still underground. So the hipsters need to get in early. I think this is your moment.
Did I tell you my story that I invented hipsterism? I did.
Did you?
In the 90s in LA. Absolutely.
Yeah, sure. Uh-huh.
Don't shore me. I was on the ground floor. I'm basically like one of the 2 or 3 people at UCLA who started hipstering.
You're literally saying like I invented hipstering before it was cool.
Yes, it's right. And Martha Burtis knows this, and she fights me on it. But I did invent hipsterism.
All right. Well, another thing that I did not know about you.
Big fan, baby. Big fan.
Well, thank you for bringing up the topic. This has been really cool, and it's a good chance for us, I think, to start playing around more with this stuff because, like you said, this is definitely something the community's asking for, or they're even asking for it without knowing that's what they're asking for. They're asking to go beyond the limits of what cPanel can provide, exactly. And they're asking to run applications that are out there on GitHub repos, and they don't know how to install them and doing that kind of stuff. So, what tools can we provide? What information can we provide on what's the best way to get this stuff up and running so that most people can get back to what they really want to do is to teach and to learn with these things rather than to have to be, the Mountain Dew sysadmin. So
exactly, which you do fine. So why should they worry about it?
Exactly. All right, man. Thanks for bringing it up, and hey, enjoy the rest of your day.
You too, bud. See you soon.
Later.